I'd like to welcome everybody to the 23rd annual Estes lecture. Can I have the next slide, please? The Care of Foreigner, given by Eram Alam. This lecture is given in memory of J. Worth Estes, who was a professor of pharmacology at Boston University and a significant medical historian. He was heavily involved in the Boston Medical Library. And after he passed away, an endowment was established to honor his memory with this lecture annually. Next slide, please. I'd like to thank the members of the committee who organized this lecture, especially its chair, Dr. Aldi Maria, who has done yeoman service in organizing all the details. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce the speaker. Thank you.
But it's my privilege this evening to introduce our speaker, Professor Eram Alam, who is an associate professor in the Department of History of Science. She has written an amazing book, The Care of Foreigners, How Immigrant Physicians Changed U.S. Healthcare, published by Johns Hopkins Press last year. It is so timely in the situation that we are in, and so important in providing context for the situation we're in and for the way things are, which we're now thinking about much more frequently and in depth. So it's an extremely timely topic, and we have an extremely capable person to explain it, who's done significant research in this area. And without further ado.
Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for the invitation and the generosity and for being here. I am very excited. I can't move too much, so you have to tell me if I come here, just shift me back over here to stay in Zoom. I'm a walker and a talker, but yeah, I'm very excited to present my work that I've been thinking about for the last few years, and I think it's an especially urgent topic, and sometimes, you know, this serendipitously happens, and so I get the good fortune of being able to share some of the historical work that I've been doing and bring it into this issue today. So the talk is called The Care of Foreigners. And the reason why I chose this title for the book, because it has an ambiguous directionality to it. And it was very intentional in thinking about that, is who are the people providing care, and then how in turn are they being cared for? So how is it that the United States is engaging with these foreign experts, and then how are they actually providing the care within the country? So I'll start off with this piece of legislation, or executive order rather, not legislation, that was passed September 19, 2025. And this was a restriction on entry of certain non-immigrant workers. And the Trump administration decided that the H-1B visa, which is a visa that's often used by highly skilled migrants, would now carry a $100,000 fee that the employers would have to absorb, okay, in order for them to be able to get this visa. So immigrant physicians are one of the groups that use this visa. This piece of legislation was initially aimed really at tech workers, but collateral in this are immigrant physicians who use this category along with the J visa. And immediately, the AMA realized that this is going to cause a huge problem. So 1 week after, the AMA urges the Department of Homeland Security to exempt physicians from this new $100,000 H-1B visa fee, because they realize that the hospitals where these physicians are going are not going to be able to absorb the cost of this visa processing fee. Previously, the cost was anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000. So this jump is extremely, extremely huge. And say you have 10 immigrant physicians on your staff, you allot $20,000 to $50,000 to do their visa processing, and all of a sudden now that becomes $1 million that you have to allot to do their visa processing. And so the consequence of this is that those hospitals are going to have fewer physicians come. So when you initially decided, okay, 10 physicians are going to do work here, but you can only afford maybe 6, well, then now the labor is going to be distributed across 6 people, which, as you all know, as I'm assuming most of you are physicians, that's a lot of work on each individual person that all of a sudden they have to absorb and carry. Or patients suffer, right? Those are the consequences of this. So in the H-1B visa category, there's a huge number, at least 19,000 physicians in 2024 and 2025. The yellow bracket is to just show you that used this visa structure in order to gain entry into the United States to begin their residencies. And these physicians are often coming from Asia, post-colonial Asian nations, as I call them. Largest sending countries are India, Pakistan, Philippines, Nigeria, and they're coming to work often in under-resourced communities in rural America and in urban environments where there are a shortage of physicians. So they're working in community hospitals, safety net hospitals, public hospitals, and a lot of the time they are 100% of the staff in these places. So the AMA gets really active. They write a letter to the then Secretary of Homeland Security, no longer, Kristi Noem, in which they explain that we need to do something about this problem, and you won't be able to see it, but I just want you to mark, these are all of the physicians groups that signed on. So there are about 52 physicians organizations that recognized the urgency around this issue and got activated, signed on to this letter, said, yes, this is a problem. This is actually going to be very, very detrimental to the US healthcare system. So we have to try to do whatever we can to stop this. So in March 5th, 2026, so 5-6 weeks ago, there was a bipartisan bill that was introduced to the House of Representatives where there's a goal to exempt H-1B healthcare workers from the restrictions under that executive order. Turns out a lot is happening in this country right now, and this has not made any progress in moving through. Even if nothing was happening, I don't think it would make much progress moving through. But it has not made much progress, but it has been introduced that we need a bill. Lawmakers heard all of these physicians groups coming together and saying, hey, we need to remedy this situation. We need to have some kind of legislation that will exempt healthcare workers from this situation. So I open with this to say, how did we get here? How did we get to this situation where the staffing of hospitals is completely contingent upon immigration policy that is operating at the federal level, that is reacting to the political winds and whims of a moment? How is it that these things became coupled, that the everyday care that people need is now being subjected to this kind of politics? And so this is what I explore in my book. So I think through, when did this all start? How is it that this huge cohort of immigrant physicians who came in 1965, how and why did they come? Where did they go? How did they enter into the labor force? What work did it take to actually figure out who these people are, what they can do? How do you create a standardized labor force with the world, which is a very, very huge and complicated question? And then how do they move into this place of entering into the political sphere and actually gaining quite a bit of power and prestige? So this is a 60-year story of the introduction of this labor cohort and really their huge rise to prominence within the healthcare space, and I think also just within the political infrastructure of this country in general. So I'm just going to give you a really, really brief overview of some of the high points of this and try to sketch out the story as best as I can in the limited amount of time. So I'm going to start in 1966 with the physician that I spoke with who was working at a public hospital in Washington, D.C. And he was explaining his experience to me. And he said, I have audio, but I'm not going to risk it right now. So I'm just going to read this slide and hope it goes. So he said some white patients, so this was an Indian physician who had worked for 7 years in India as a urologist, had set up a practice, and then decided that he wanted to come to the United States. And so as he entered into practice in the United States, every immigrant physician has to restart their residency, or they have to start as residents. So he was starting as a resident, he entered the clinical space, and as he was talking about his experience. And he said, some white patients would say, if I want to change something, you have to ask the main doctor before you change anything. Some patients, in fact, I remember a Black guy in Washington, D.C. He said, this was my second year here. He said, you come from the Cobra snake charmer's land. How do you learn? Do you know much of medicine? So I am somebody who's a historian of medicine who thinks about race, political economy, this globalization of labor. So when I see or I hear something like this raises an alarm in my ears because this is exactly what I'm trying to understand. How is it that somebody who is a foreign expert comes here, and what are the ways, how are they interpreted within this clinical interaction? So the white patients are questioning their expertise. The Black patients are also questioning their expertise, each using a different kind of frame to challenge the position of this person within the clinical interaction. And again, especially because of the moment, which I'm going to give you a little bit more historical background, this is extremely interesting to me because we're in 1966, and the 60s are key in understanding why this quote is so interesting. So just keep this in mind. And we start here, and then we end with, the today story. And so I'm going to take you through a little journey of the care of foreigners. So first, I'll give you a little history of the arrivals. We'll go into customs and declaration, baggage claim, and then an extended stay. So I'm going to kind of use this travel metaphor to carry us through this talk. So the arrival. Foreign physicians arrived in 1965 under the Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act. And this bill was different than previous pieces of legislation in the United States because it was recruiting skilled migrants for the first time. And upon signing the bill, this is Lyndon B. Johnson, he's signing it at the Statue of Liberty, and he said the following. Oh, okay. We have audio, but that is not playing. So we're gonna, let's see. Okay. Complicated thing. Now the audio is playing out of my computer. We'll just ignore that. But he signed this piece of legislation, and he said, this bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives or add importantly to our wealth or power. And he went on to say, yet it is one of the most important acts of this Congress and of this administration, for it repairs a very deep and painful flaw in the fabric of American justice. It corrects a cruel and enduring wrong. Okay, so what is he talking about? Well, first, the cruel and enduring wrong that he's talking about is this 1924 piece of immigration legislation that was the most comprehensive legislation passed before 65. And in that, there were two components. One was called the National Origins Act, which is, there was a quota for people from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the other component of that was called the Asian Exclusion Act, which did exactly that. It barred people from the Asia-Pacific Triangle, which is a ginormous part of the world, from being allowed to join the United States and be citizens. So in 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson recognized that amidst the Cold War, this kind of closed isolationist gesture towards the rest of the world was going to be detrimental to the US's political success. So these post-colonial Asian nations, if you just said, hey, we don't like you, don't come here, there was this fear that they would be seduced by the communist sphere of influence and would lean that way. And so immigration became this really important tool of foreign policy because it was this way of suggesting to these countries, we're open, we're capitalist countries, we want you to come and be a part of our fabric, to circulate through our countries, come, get educated, perhaps go back, maybe you'll stay. Things like the Fulbright program were all a part of this sort of soft diplomacy to start this circulation of people and ideas. So that's what he was talking about. And I highlight every single one of the nots because Lyndon B. Johnson didn't want to make the American public feel afraid. He was all of this hedging but don't worry, it's not going to be a big deal. Just relax. Don't be scared of the immigrants. It's not what this is about. This is about geopolitics. It's not about the actual material people who are going to come here. Well, in fact, he was very, very wrong when it came to this assessment. And there was a whole series of reasons why this completely changed the composition of the US healthcare workforce. So prior to this Hart-Celler Act, in 1963, JFK passed the Health Professions Assistance Act. And this was designed to help recruit medical students from more disadvantaged backgrounds, to offer loan support, and to also offer construction grants to actually grow the medical schools so you could have more people come. And Kennedy, when he started this program, he said, this is just the beginning. We are in this situation where we're hitting this shortage problem and we need to scale up. We need to figure out some kind of solution. And so he's passed this to start that. 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act. In this suite of pieces of legislation, one of the most pivotal when it came to healthcare specifically is that hospitals were forced to desegregate if they wanted to receive any kind of federal reimbursements. So this was one of the most effective pieces of legislation to force open segregated hospitals. And people just had a different orientation to healthcare, and it started shifting into this language of healthcare is a right. It's no longer just this luxury good that should be reserved for the higher classes, that this is something, with labor unions having power at this time, with Black communities really arguing for this, that this is something that should be accessible to more people. So we have desegregation that's happening here. 1964, July, Medicare and Medicaid pass. So Medicare, I'm sure you all know, over 65, Medicare people who are low income. Now the federal government is subsidizing that. So overnight, 23 million people who are high users of medical care, or who are high needs rather, can now enter into the medical marketplace. So all of these changes are happening within the span of just a few years. And so then immigration becomes this very, very useful tool on the domestic level to also start to deal with some of these issues. So, geopolitically, we're signaling we're open to all of these countries. Domestically, we start saying, you know what, we're going to recruit skilled migrants specifically to come, and we're going to ask them to work in very, very specific areas to fulfill the needs that we need because of all of these changes that have happened in the preceding years. So the numbers are huge. In the column to my right, you'll see US medical graduates. The column next to that, it says total, and that's just the total of the two other columns of immigrants and non-immigrant exchange visitors. It's just visa categories. I can't walk there, but if I were able to, even before this, but around 1965 and going down to 1973, you see there's a huge number of immigrant physicians that are entering the workforce, sometimes more than US trained physicians. So these are not small numbers. When LBJ is talking about this being a very little shift that's going to happen, this is a huge shift when it comes to care. And another huge change that happens is the place where people are coming from. So Asia becomes the dominant continent from where all of these people are coming. Prior to this, we had a lot of European migration post-World War II or during World War II and post. And then there's a shift that happened where Asia becomes the largest sending continent. In 1977, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare started to look at this issue. And one of the people who was the head of the congressional session, he said, quote, based on current data, physician migration to the United States each year represents about 1/4 of the annual output of all the medical schools of the world outside of China, the USSR, and the socialist countries of Eastern Europe. So this is a very politically marked migration that is emerging. Very, very clear from this. And it's doing these two very important things. It is solving this geopolitical issue, and it's solving this domestic staffing issue. But here's this problem. So Hart-Celler is allowing for the entry of all of these people, but there are these serious questions that organized medicine has about all of these people that are now entering into the space. There was, how do you know that these people actually know the things that they say that they know? Right? How do you assess that? How do you figure out if that is actually true and accurate? And so this question of qualifications and this fear, rather, that foreign physicians are unqualified really, really came to dominate a lot of the ways that the organized medicine started to think about this issue. So with really this influx of global labor came this influx of anxiety. So the way that I think about it is, namely, how does a system that is structured and historically, this is, and we can talk more about this, to produce basically a wealthy white male physician cohort contend with these individuals that are challenging that normative construction, that are coming from elsewhere, and how do you then create this commensurate supply of global medical labor? And then again, this question, could these people be trusted and could they be relied on to provide effective care? So after much discussion and many failed attempts, a lot of the organizations, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Medical Colleges, the US government all got involved, and they decided that they would give the ECFMG, or the Educational Council of Foreign Medical Graduates, that this institutional body would become this kind of obligatory passage point for all immigrant physicians. So it would be the entity to manage this huge flow of difference from all over the world, because it was too ad hoc and people couldn't figure out what exactly was going on. And so their charge was as follows: to give graduates of recognized foreign medical schools an opportunity to establish their qualifications for undertaking medical training in US hospitals, and to provide hospitals and state boards with the means of identifying those foreign medical graduates who are qualified. Okay, that sounds very stale. And when I see this, these are the things that I start to think about. What does it mean to recognize? What does it mean to establish? What does it mean to identify? And what does it mean to qualify? All of these had to be procedurally figured out. And it was very, very difficult at the beginning. So one of the ways that the ECFMG decided maybe we'll try to do this is like, okay, well, in 1953, the World Health Organization compiled a list of medical schools in the world. If you look at this list, sometimes there's an address, sometimes there's a list of schools, sometimes there's a little bit more, but they say right at the beginning of their huge compendium, the descriptive accounts and factual material which make up this directory may be considered as part of the raw data on which the reader can base his own independent analysis. They're intended to be no more than a general guide. And so they hedge this. They put a disclaimer that we're just trying to compile this stuff, but we don't actually have that much information. And if you look region to region, there's a huge discrepancy in the amount of information they've actually been able to collect. And, as I looked further into this, sometimes as state medical boards, sometimes people would recognize a medical school because they went on vacation to India. And I'm pretty sure when I was on vacation, I saw that school when I was on a trip. This is the kind of way that recognition and things were operating. And so it was moving into this book. But again, this book, who's going out and doing this kind of assessment? This was all very, very questionable. So finally, the ECFMG came up with this exam that was supposed to do this work of one step of standardization. And the exam had roughly 350 multiple choice questions and an English language portion. So this became the first step for these physicians to take and be able to enter into the United States. But even well after they arrived, and I'm going to speed up because we lost some time due to technical difficulties, but after they passed this exam and entered into the United States, they had this whole dossier of documentation that they had to assemble in order to convince state medical boards, in order to convince hospitals that they had the privileges, that they had the experience that they claimed to have. And they repeatedly faced questions that challenged their expertise, often with paperwork becoming this very important alibi to deny professional opportunities and to restrict mobility. So I'm just going to go through a very, very quick case of a physician who came to the United States. He completed his training in 1975 from Bangalore Medical College, and he worked in the United States for 8 years. He decided after 8 years that he was on the West Coast and he wanted to move to Chicago. So wanted to work at a hospital in the suburbs of Chicago, and so he applied there for hospital privileges. Again, he had been working already in the United States for a very long period of time. So he assembled his dossier for hospital privileges, he submitted his paperwork, and he received this response back. So you might not be able to see it, but I just want to highlight 2 things. So one, the documentation that he received did not list his full name. And the certificates that he brought, so these were the transcripts, they were hand delivered to the hospital instead of being mailed directly from his medical school. So the director denied him privileges from the hospital. And so he, which this is only to represent his anger, I want you to see, was very upset and typed a very, very angry letter, from which I'm just going to pull out a few quotes. And he said, regarding my last and middle names being initialized, I enclosed a copy of an article from an Indian magazine, which I thought provided the explanation. All of the documents I have in my possession have my name written this way. It's a cultural, geographic, and local practice from the area of the country I come from to write names that way. And he goes on to say, it took me more than 3 months, several phone calls, and many trips from my relatives in India to the medical school to obtain the documents. I hope you would appreciate the practical difficulties in obtaining letters from 10,000 miles away for a graduate who completed medical school nearly 13 years ago. 26% of licensed physicians in this country are foreign physicians, and we are part of this country just as anybody else. You have letters and scores of other documents in support of my application from your US peers. To fool or convince all of you for the past several years must make me darn good at my profession. And the things that I find really important in what he was saying is, for him, this denial in the hospital is a denial of his place in the United States. He's clearly making this linkage where you invited me to come to this place based on the skill set that I had, and now you're rejecting me based on the skill set that I had, which to him is experienced as a rejection of his place within the United States as well. And so he is trying to provide all of this additional documentation to support and verify the thing. So he's saying, I'm getting letters of recommendation from your colleagues, and yet you're still not believing me in this situation. So no matter how thick the file was, the director came back and he said, nope, not going to happen. And so he was not able to gain privileges there. But the point that I want to draw out from this is that this is not, he's been working for 7 years already. He has all of this additional support, but it's these kinds of, you don't fit within the bureaucratic infrastructure. You literally don't fit on the form. Therefore, your name doesn't fit on the form. Therefore, you will be disallowed from performing your duty. So this question of fit and adjustment was not only one-sided. Immigrant physicians often reflected on the shock that they experienced when they came to the United States. So one of my interlocutors came in came right when the MLK was assassinated in 1967, and those are images from the south side of Chicago, southwest side, which is right where Cook County Hospital, which is the largest public hospital in Chicago, is located, and it was bombed out as a result of the protests around that moment. And so he talked about when he came to Cook County, he couldn't believe that he was in America because I saw nothing but Black people that in that area at that time. And it was not very developed, and there were a lot of old burnt out houses. That was the time when MLK was recently assassinated, so there was a lot of rioting. For a while, I was shocked. Where am I? He said, where I am. It was an extremely difficult adjustment period for me, actually. So I just wanted to also bring in their perspective of this, of entering into this space where from time of receiving his visa to actually being in the United States and working in the hospital for this physician was a matter of 2 months. And he talked about all of his experiences with this concept of America that was, and we can talk about, US propaganda, especially in South Asia, was very, very high in all of these information offices. So the way that the US was being represented was not at all, it did not at all look like the experience that he had of this place. And he had no sense when he was walking in either. And so this kind of dislocation that he experienced and all of these physicians experienced, they had to operate differently in order to be able to enter into the clinical interaction, whether that was different kind of ways of caring oneself, different kinds of ways of entering into an interaction, different ways of dealing with their colleagues or their superiors. But it was a whole suite of strategies that they developed and deployed so that they could yield a successful therapeutic encounter for their patients. So by the 1980s, I'm going to speed up quite a bit. The migration and the presence of foreign physicians in the United States was becoming a very regular occurrence. Year after year, you had, thousands of people coming in order to in order to staff these underserved hospitals all across the country. And in the 1980s, then there was also the recession, right? So there was this shift to much more conservative fiscal strategies and economics, and there was healthcare was a huge, huge driving force for all of these economic shifts that were happening. And healthcare inflation was this problem, and so Congress started to think about this issue, and foreign physicians became a place where there was conversation around cutting them, that they're the problem that is causing, these huge increases in spending when it comes to Medicare because they pay so much for graduate medical education. And so there was this large conversation of, okay, how are we going to figure out how to cut them? So foreign physicians were feeling really on the back foot by this whole thing. Like, wait, what? You just invited us here. Then now 20 years later, now we're a problem. There's this fear that we're a surplus now. There's this fear that we just need to be cut. How is it that we're just being added and subtracted in these political moments like this? And so they also started to pay attention and realize, well, we've been in this country now for about 20 years, even if we're not working at the premier institutions, we're still often making a decent living. We often are not in debt because we came from countries where public education is the best education, and so medical education is subsidized, so we don't have debt, we're able to earn. And so they start to really think about the resources that they have. They start to think about how is it that we can effectively use our financial capital to start influencing the ways that our community is being perceived. And so one of the first things that many organizers did was they hired a lobbyist. And one of my main interlocutors was located in DC, and he happened to meet this lobbyist who told him, the first thing that you need to do is you need to start collecting data. You need to start getting people to write down all of the things, what they're experiencing, the kinds of discrimination they're experiencing, the kinds of things that are happening to them. And so that's what they started to do. Here is just one, so they created these forms and they sent them out broadly to the community. They used ethnic newspapers to get people to start talking about these things. And they said, okay, let's start collecting. So there was one physician who wanted to, there was a job for a radiology opening. He was denied because he was told he was born in the wrong country. Another physician, sorry, there's a little bit of a lag. Another physician who wanted to switch from one state to the next, and the board refused his license because they wanted more information on his medical school, the CVs of all of his professors that taught anatomy, physiology, and he kept saying, well, India doesn't publish these things, I can't get them from also so many years ago, and so he was denied. So they really started to accumulate all of this information. They said, we're going to have two plans of attack. We're going to take this to the AMA because the majority of us are part of the American Medical Association, and we're going to make an argument for the fact that we need our own special section. So they said, women have their own section because it's understood that there's a different set of circumstances that women who enter the workplace have to deal with. Well, immigrant physicians should also have their own, they should have the support of the community in dealing with the issues that are unique and specific to that community. And there was a long, drawn-out contestation around this. And at the end of the day, the AMA at that time said, no, we don't care. If you feel like you're discriminated against, this is a legal issue. You need to go and either deal with this in the courts or you need to deal with this with Congress. So that's what they did. One of the physicians who was very, very integral to doing a lot of this organizing work would go every single Wednesday. He was based in DC. He closed up his medical practice and would go and hang out with his lobbyist buddy that he hired in the Democratic social clubs and try to talk with aides and try to talk with Congress people to raise the agenda, to raise the issue of immigrant physicians and say there is something here that we need to pay attention to. And so what they decided on was, maybe if we have this exam that we have to take that's different from what US physicians have to take. So maybe that's one of the places where we can intervene, because we can equalize. If we could just say, well, we all take the same exam, so maybe that's one level of parity that we can at least say, like, we're not being tested on different things. So that was their huge point of intervention, that we're going to try to argue for that, and we're going to try to argue for some kind of centralized system where all of our documentation can exist, so that when we want to move from one state to the next or one hospital to the next, you can just, I don't know if you all have to write letters of recommendation like I do, but you have these interfolio, where you can just have this kind of set place where these letters are, and then any time you need them, you can kind of just draw them from that central repository. And so this is what they decided to do, and they were instructed also by their lobbyist to become chummy with the politicians. And that is really what they ended up doing. So one of the people that they started to really pay attention to was Congressman Jim Bates from California. And he they started sending these messages around in the ethnic newspaper, one of which is, I quote, "Congressman Bates had a tough election campaign. He's incurred some debt. I request all of this physicians associations that they'd organized to contribute $1,000 each as soon as possible. He will definitely appreciate all we've done for him in the past, and he's anxiously awaiting our positive response." So they started to learn that, okay, well, money talks. And if they are helping these campaigns, that ultimately this could influence this piece of legislation that they wanted to pass in going through. And even media outlets started to notice that something interesting was going on. So in this article that was printed in the Washington Post in 1989, Jim Bates was specifically called out for accepting large sums of money from foreign physicians group after he sponsored legislation to support the same testing requirements. And from that interview, so they had organized into an association of Filipino, Pakistani, and Indian physicians. And he said, well, they're hardly among the large givers of honoraria to members of Congress, but 12 such groups paid Bates speaking fees over the past 14 months after Bates sponsored specific legislation to benefit the group. When asked to comment, he said, "It's more trouble than it's worth. It's not like they're pumping money into me." But it turns out for others, they were actually pumping money into them. So Stephen Solars, who was a representative from New York, he had the second largest treasure chest because he called himself, he's like, "I am the advocate of all of the South Asian physicians." And they really, really took him in and adopted him. And one of his aides, he came back and he said, this was so good. So he said, "This whole Asian thing happened. We started raising money without any real effort. By and large, it's a group that's untouched by other politicians." And so he started to, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this group. So Stephen Solars, Jim Bates, they supported this legislation. And ultimately in 1992, the Health Professions Reauthorization Act was passed, and they were able to get equal exams for immigrant physicians and US trained physicians. So there's this kind of political knowledge and this political acumen that's also starting to develop, understanding ways of using capital, ways of using their social location, their professional location, their status and authority in order to start to influence and kind of change a little bit of the narrative around what they were experiencing. So to just quickly conclude, then let's think about this extended stay situation. And immigrant physicians are here to stay. They are a quarter of the US physician labor force. They are absolutely fundamental to the everyday quotidian functioning of the US healthcare system in health profession shortage areas where 80 million people reside. They are anywhere from 40 to 70% of the physicians that are working there. In all of the least lucrative specialties are largely staffed by immigrant physicians doing the kind of frontline work of family medicine, internal medicine, pediatrics. And this became very, very apparent during the COVID pandemic. So June, everything is closed, 2020. And then all of a sudden, the State Department has these special mission critical visas that they're willing to give. So we encourage medical professionals seeking work in the US on a work exchange visa, particularly, this is the H, which is the one that now Trump has made so expensive and cost prohibitive, particularly those working on COVID-19 issues, to contact the nearest US embassy for a visa appointment. So we're in this dire shortage situation. This is a huge emergency. What are we going to do? We're going to call the immigrant physicians. Come on over and come and take care of us. And so they asked for these physicians to come and wrote letters on letters on letters to Secretary of State, Secretary of Homeland Security to explain, these people play a vital role in providing care. And they're working in the places where you have the most vulnerable populations, in nursing homes, in community hospitals, et cetera, with, again, people who have the most complications as well, and so will suffer the worst outcomes from COVID-related illnesses. And for the sake of time in Q&A, I'm going to just speed up a little bit. But this issue that we're thinking through right now of these shortages. And whenever there's a shortage, immigrant physicians are then called up to contend with that issue. The pandemic was an emergency situation, but this is a daily practice, is what I am trying to argue, that this is something that started in 1965 and continues today and is projected to continue well into the future. Now it's complicated because we have an immigration regime that is very, very unsympathetic to difference, to people from elsewhere. And as a consequence, we're going to see that this kind of chaotic regime is going to have the worst effects on the communities that were being cared for by these physicians. And still, despite this very, very antagonistic, unwelcoming environment, this from class of 2026, 2027, we have a whole new internal medicine residency. They're at least 50% from the same school in Pakistan that are from King Edward Medical College. They're coming from India. They're coming from Pakistan. This is another school. This is another, from Match Day. It's great for me because I just screenshot all of these. You have people from Pakistan, India, Adio, India, Dow Medical College is also in Pakistan. And so you have people who are continually trying to come to try to do this work. And we're in a situation where we're in limbo right now. I think July 1 will be really, really an informative moment to see who can actually come to this country. Now that many, many more countries are on the banned list, like Nigeria, for example, which is the 4th largest sending country. I think it remains to be seen what the effects of this will be on the most vulnerable populations in the United States. But I am hopeful that at some point that the recognition that this cohort of people are so absolutely integral to the everyday existence of this country will kind of rise and be recognized, and that their work will be recognized. And thank you. And I will unmute this, Liz.
Thank you, Dr. Alam. I think we have time for some questions. Are there any in the house? Dr. Maria?
Thank you very much for weaving that multiple strands history. Could you comment on sort of the Cold War era and active recruitment of physicians to come?
Yeah, so it was a really, am I allowed to move a little bit? Okay. It was a very central focus because the Cold War is being fought. Science and medicine are these very, very important arenas, these political arenas where the Cold War is being fought. This is why you had the space race. This is why that these are absolutely vital areas. And so the US understood that it didn't have enough scientists, engineers, and physicians to be able to compete with the kind of production that was happening in the USSR at that time. And so part of what they were doing is the idea was while we're building our infrastructure inside the country, that we will try to recruit talent to kind of expedite and catalyze this process. And so all throughout this period, the US had these information offices that were distributed in every major city in Asia, in Latin America. And what happened in those places is that there were libraries, and there were places where people could access medical journals. And so individual hospitals would literally go and advertise in their medical journals, we have a spot for you here. We'll pay for your plane ticket. We'll help you with your licensing. Call this number. And so that was the way that people were able to get access to this information. But it was really a part of this US propaganda machine as well. So I think embedded in these multiple layers.
So thank you very much. It was interesting context. So H-1Bs are like half of the story, right? And the J-1 visa, exchange visitor visa, is really probably the majority of people who come for medical training. And last year, at the same time that $100,000 business was introduced, there was a proposed change to the number of years you could renew a J1 visa, setting it so that it would really make it, and then there was a comment period and then nothing. So we haven't heard the end of it. But if it is approved, that change, it would mean essentially that an immigrant physician would not be able to do a fellowship unless it was just a 3-year residency and a 1-year fellowship, which is the exception to the rule. So, and at the same time, just before this is happening, the state licensing boards of the United States just took a major step to try to increase the ability of immigrant physicians to get licensed by decreasing some of the rules. You've got the map of which states did it, and thinking that that was going to help, and then this sort of works against it. And then just very, very recently, the American Board of Medical Specialties began promulgating a change in eligibility for board certification examinations at the same time that these visa cuts are happening. I think on balance, more will be prevented from coming than any of these things would ever be able to help. How much time do we have with this before the number of immigrants has decreased to the point where healthcare will be sabotaged for the next 50 years or something like that? Like if these things go on for 3 years, 4 years, how many years will it take before we're cooked, essentially?
I mean, that's a tough question. And but I'm with you in really it's ticking. It's very, very close because we have all of these countercurrents that are blocked. And even when you were talking about the pieces of legislation. So the Tennessee, very, very conservative legislature they were the first state to pass an alternative pathways for immigrant physicians. So instead of starting a residency, they had a specific thing. If you worked for a specific number of years and you had kind of somebody as your supervisor, you could do this for 1 year and then get a license. But the state licensing board doesn't want to recognize it. So even at all of these points, you have a little bit of movement, and then you have this blockage. And I think this is what we're working through is the US has this ambivalent relationship to immigration. It knows that it has this problem with healthcare, and it can't square that. And so we see it over and over and over again, where attempts are being made to do this, the Conrad 30, the J1 visa, to expand that, which is a special waiver. So somebody is on a J visa, if they're working in an under-resourced community, so the J visa has a return requirement. And so this absolves that return requirement, and they can stay and work in a shortage area community. And so there's this push to try to increase some of those. But then immigration is completely banned from so many of these countries that are sending physicians. So your guess is as good as mine, but I think you really did an amazing job of thinking, laying out for us all of these countercurrents that are operating.
I can tell you right now here in this medical the department I'm involved with, we have a 6-year residency program. We could not safely take anybody on a J1 visa because there's a chance that they wouldn't be able to stay for 6 years, and then they'd have to leave with 2 years left in their training. They wouldn't be able to be eligible to finish, and we would be stuck, without a physician. So it's very much happening right here.
Yeah, and this is what just from learning from the match to July 1, I think these are the points at which we're seeing the first effects of these. And I was looking at reading a story recently where medical directors were saying, I'm just not going to take this risk because I don't want this spot to remain unfilled.
Noel, are there any questions online?
Yeah, I can share a couple. One is, it says, while Indian physicians and I think general South Asian physicians and immigrants were the largest immigrant group, there were also physicians coming in from Europe, Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere in Asia. Did all of the immigrant doctors face this kind of harassment about credentials, or was it worse for South Asians? E.g., were state boards anti-immigrant or anti-South Asian?
Yeah, I think they were anti-immigrant. The reason why I focus on South Asian physicians is because they comprised and continue to comprise the largest cohort of physicians. And so I use them as this representative example. And they had from the Philippines, from Pakistan, and from India. And those are all colonial legacies for why those places are the specific places why people are coming. There's a reason why there aren't as many Chinese physicians, because medical education is not being conducted in English. And so even to pass the English language exam, when you have these post-colonial nations where English is the language of education, then it becomes an easier route for that. So it's not, it's happening everywhere. I focus on them because of the largest demographic and historically the largest demographic.
And then there's another one saying we clearly need these MDs from overseas, but what is keeping this country's medical schools from expanding their classes to reduce that need for immigrant physicians?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question that I throw out to all of the leaders of the field who are.
But in answer to they are expanding. They're expanding tremendously. And that also is keeping immigrant physicians out of the country. Because, for instance, the osteopathic schools, some of them are for profit, but they don't, we contemplated our naval here for about 5 or 10 years before we decided to increase the class size. And now it's doubled what it used to be. But, a lot of the osteopathic schools said, well, in July, we're going to put up a new school, another 300 seats. And so there was actually, I think there used to be a 15 by 15, before 2015, they wanted a 15% increase in medical seats. There's been a huge increase in the number of medical school graduates here. And that also is a pressure that keeps immigrant physicians at bay out of the country as well. It's very complicated.
But the pace of...
There's actually a rate limiting step that is more important than the number of medical school slots. It's the number of residency slots.
Yeah.
And the number of residency slots means that there's a limit on how many foreign medical graduates we can train. And there are legislators who are attempting to address that by saying that if you're a fully qualified neurosurgeon, you don't have to do another residency in neurosurgery. That's important because there was a period of time recently where if you had a brain injury between here and Albany, God help you, there was no qualified neurosurgeon between here and Albany. But there was a phlebotomist who was a fully qualified neurosurgeon who lived in Springfield. That's really scary.
Yeah.
Is there yeah, Magdalena?
This might be going a little bit too much sideways because I know you were focusing mainly on physicians, but curious in your research whether you whether you encountered any material related to nurses or PCAs or other members of the of healthcare.
Yes, thank you so much. So I can recommend you two really, really wonderful books. One is by Catherine Choi, which is called Empire of Care. And it is about Filipino nurse migration and the historical legacies based in US colonization of the Philippines and really starting nursing as a profession there. I'm doing a lot of work to catalyze that, and then now that being a historical antecedent to the huge numbers that we see today. So that is a great book. And then by Sujani Reddy, which is called Nursing in Empire, I believe, and that's about Indian nurses from Kerala, and there's a huge influx of them as well. So they did that work that I relied on, but there are these corollary pathways that nurses are traveling on as well, and for a lot of the same reasons from these same countries, because of these colonial legacies of these institutions getting established, of English being the dominant mode of understanding and education there. And so, yes, thank you.
Why is only Medicare paying for graduate medical education? I mean, a lot of other insurers are there and they're also providing care to the patients.
Yeah, so
I don't know why only Medicare supplementing.
Well, when this decision came to, it was to make sure that there was a stable source, that you weren't at the whims of an insurance company who from one year to the next decided not to do it. So the whole function of it was to actually try to stabilize the cost, to make so that the US government was going to just be in charge of that. And so that was the logic.
There's a small trend of for-profit healthcare sponsoring residencies. And they tend to get a lot of international graduates, but they're very much at risk because if something happens to their accreditation, ICE swoops in and people are not safe. As soon, because the day you lose your position in training,
Yeah.
that day you're eligible to be deported.
Is there another question?
I can ask another. This is kind of related to what we were just talking about. We don't have enough resident spots funded for US grads. How do we square that with demand for foreign physicians? Are we stealing talent from poorer countries that also need these positions?
Yeah, that is a really important and complex question that gets written as brain drain from these sending countries to the United States. And it was an issue that was talked about extensively in the 1960s when this began. And so there's a couple of competing things that are operating. One is that if you're in a liberal democracy, you can't prevent freedom of movement. That's one of the basic human rights that is supposed to be entrenched in the ways that liberal democracies are organized. So you can't tell somebody, you can't go here, you can't do this. So the way that people have tried to think about this is, how do you incentivize people to stay? How do you create conditions where people might want to do that? And many countries, India tried to do this. There was in 1969, they decided that they would not allow this ECFMG exam that was usually conducted at embassies. They said they wouldn't allow it anymore. So there was a 6-month period where they said, you can't take this exam. So people like very now disgraced Deepak Chopra went to Sri Lanka in order to take this exam and bypass it. People would go to Iran in order to take this exam and bypass it. And so there are these attempts to try to retain a physician workforce, but it's a very complicated problem that the WHO 2010, they said, okay, this is not just a country by country or one country to another country issue. This is a global issue that requires a real strategy and attention from all of these different countries to figure out how to think equitably, because this is going to matter for everybody's health at the end of the day. When a pandemic comes, and when a pandemic, I'm a historian, right? When a pandemic comes again, everybody has to be prepared. Pandemic preparedness is not going to work. It's not going to, borders are not going to do anything in that kind of situation. So I think it's an open question. It's a political question, and it's one that will take a lot of work in order to iron out.
Thank you, Dr. Elam. This is a wonderfully informative talk. Appreciate it. If you have additional questions, if you send them to Noelle, she can send them along to you. Thank you very much for coming. On behalf of the BML, we appreciate it.
Thank you so much.